At my grandmother's funeral, my sister pulled a yellowed piece of paper from the keepsake box, laughed directly in my face, tore the corner and threw it into the cemetery trash can. My arrogant brother-in-law smirked and told me it was the exact kind of garbage my career deserved. I did not shed a single tear. I simply waited for their luxury cars to pull away, reached into the trash and smoothed out the crumpled document. When the regional bank director saw the hidden red wax seal and the encrypted barcode, the very next day, the color completely drained from his face. My name is Stella. I am 33 years old, working as a data architect in Chicago, and I am finally free from the toxic shadow of my family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up on the affluent North Shore of Chicago meant pristine lawns and freezing emotional isolation. My mother Patricia and my father Richard treated affection as a currency meant only for the highest bidder. My older sister Cassie was their absolute masterpiece. She was loud, demanding, and constantly rewarded for simply existing. Whenever Cassidy threw a tantrum, she received a new car or an expensive vacation. Meanwhile, I was the quiet data nerd, the invisible middle child who spent weekends writing code and building analytical models in my bedroom. I learned very early that my presence in the household was merely tolerated. The bitter wind cut through my black wool coat as we stood near the fresh grave of Grandma Beatrice. She was the only person in our bloodline who had ever looked at me with genuine warmth. Beatrice was a sharp, fiercely independent woman who had navigated the brutal corporate world of the 1960s. She taught me to look for patterns in the chaos, to trust numbers over empty promises. Now she was gone, leaving a massive void in my heart. The funeral service had concluded, but the true spectacle was just beginning. Patricia had instructed the estate executor to bring a small mahogany box of Beatrice's personal keepsakes directly to the burial site. It was supposed to be a moment of quiet reflection before we left the cemetery. Instead, Cassidy treated it like a clearance sale. Cassidy pushed past the mourning relatives, her designer heels sinking into the damp earth. She aggressively dug through the mahogany box, tossing aside antique brooches and old photographs with total disdain. She was hunting for something valuable, something shiny to add to her collection. She scoffed at a beautiful silver pocket watch and threw it back into the velvet-lined interior. Then she pulled out a sealed manila envelope. My name was written across the front in Beatrice's elegant, sloping handwriting. Without a shred of hesitation or respect for my privacy, Cassidy ripped the envelope open. She pulled out a heavy yellowed piece of parchment. I stepped forward, holding out my hand. "That has my name on it, Cassidy. Hand it over right now." Cassidy ignored me entirely. She held the paper up to the gray sky, her eyes scanning the faded type. "It is a founder's equity bond from 1960, she announced loudly, making sure the lingering aunts and uncles could hear. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Seriously, Stella, the old bat left you a piece of scrap paper from the Stone Age." Her husband, DeAndre, stepped up right beside her. DeAndre was a self-proclaimed wealth management guru who never missed a chance to flaunt his supposed financial genius. As an African-American man who had aggressively climbed the corporate ladder, he demanded total respect in every room he entered, but he consistently chose to use his power to belittle others. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and snatched the paper from Cassidy's hand. He scoffed, flicking the vintage parchment with his manicured fingernail. "A 1960 paper bond. What an absolute joke. The issuing bank probably went bankrupt 40 years ago. It is not even worth the ink printed on it." He looked me up and down with absolute contempt. "This is fitting for you, Stella. You sit in a tiny cubicle crunching meaningless data all day while real players move millions in the market. You get the expired garbage." I looked at my mother, hoping for a single ounce of intervention. Patricia just tightened her silk scarf and looked away, completely validating their cruelty through her silence. My father was already checking his expensive watch, bored by the entire interaction. Cassidy snatched the paper back from DeAndre. She smiled maliciously, pinched the top right corner of the document, and deliberately tore the thick parchment. The sharp sound of ripping paper echoed over the silent graves. She crumpled the document into a loose ball and tossed it carelessly over my shoulder. It landed straight into a rusted green trash can, designated for discarded floral wire. "You can keep the trash," Stella Cassidy sneered. "Try not to spend it all in one place." Laughter rippled through the small group of relatives. They turned their backs on me, linking arms as they walked toward the waiting line of black limousines. DeAndre clapped my father on the shoulder, already discussing their dinner reservations at an exclusive downtown steakhouse. They left me standing alone by the fresh dirt of my grandmother's grave. I stood perfectly still on the damp grass. I did not cry. I did not yell. Years of dealing with their emotional abuse had taught me that reacting only fueled their sick entertainment. I waited until the sleek black cars disappeared down the winding cemetery road, the sound of their engines fading into the Chicago wind. Then I walked over to the rusted green bin. I reached inside past the wilted carnations and damp leaves and pulled out the crumpled ball of yellowed parchment. I carefully smoothed out the harsh creases against my coat. My trained eyes, accustomed to scanning thousands of lines of complex code, examined the layout of the document. DeAndre was a fool. He only looked at the surface value of things. As the late afternoon sun hit the paper at a specific angle, a faint shadow revealed itself beneath the text. Hidden right under the heavy black ink of the founder's signature was a perfectly preserved embossed red wax seal. But that was not all. Below that seal, cleverly integrated into the ornate border design of the certificate, was a complex vertical barcode. The precision of the geometric lines was astonishing. That specific barcode technology was completely out of place for a document printed in 1960. It was an anachronism, a deliberate anomaly hiding in plain sight. A spark of pure adrenaline hit my chest. My grandmother had not left me a piece of trash. This was a masterfully encrypted financial instrument, and I was going to decode exactly what she had hidden inside it. I walked through the revolving glass doors of Vanguard Financial exactly at opening time the next morning. The downtown Chicago headquarters was a fortress of polished marble, towering ceilings, and aggressive wealth. It was the kind of place designed to make ordinary people feel incredibly small. Men in tailored Italian suits and women carrying designer bags glided across the lobby with absolute entitlement. I gripped the worn edges of the manila envelope inside my coat pocket. My heart maintained a steady, calculated rhythm. Panic was a luxury I could not afford. My entire life had been a masterclass in surviving hostile environments. I approached the premium client services desk. The brass plaque on the counter identified the teller as Kevin. He was a young, slickly groomed man, wearing a condescending smirk that instantly reminded me of DeAndre. Kevin was busy typing an email on his monitor, completely ignoring my presence for a full minute to establish dominance. When he finally looked up, his eyes quickly scanned my plain black wool coat and practical flat shoes. His smile did not reach his eyes. "Can I help you find the standard retail line, ma'am?" Kevin asked, his voice dripping with fake politeness. "The premium desk is reserved for high net worth account holders." "I am exactly where I need to be," I replied calmly. I reached into my pocket and slid the yellowed parchment across the pristine marble counter. "I need to authenticate and exercise the rights attached to this instrument." Kevin sighed loudly, making a show of his inconvenience. He picked up the 1960 Founder Equity Bond by the very corner Cassidy had torn the day before. He did not even bother to read the text. He glanced at the faded ink, scoffed, and tossed it back toward me like a discarded fast food wrapper. "Ma'am, this is a joke," Kevin sneered. "People bring in fake historical bonds all the time, hoping to cash in on some imaginary inheritance. This looks like a prop from a high school play. It does not even have a modern routing number. Take this garbage out of my line before I call security and have you escorted from the building for attempted fraud." His dismissal hit me like a familiar wave of freezing water. It was the exact same tone my parents used whenever I asked for basic support. I remembered being 19 years old, sitting at the kitchen table begging my father to co-sign a tiny student loan so I could finish my data analytics degree. He had flatly refused, claiming my education was a terrible return on investment. The very next day, my mother wired $50,000 to Cassidy simply because she wanted to backpack across Europe to find herself, while my sister posted photos from luxury yachts in the Mediterranean. I worked graveyard shifts at a data processing center, eating stale instant noodles and teaching myself complex database architecture. They starved me of resources, but they unintentionally forged a weapon. I learned how to dismantle systems from the inside out. I did not back down. I planted both hands firmly on the marble counter and leaned in close. "You are going to want to look closer, Kevin," I said, dropping my voice to a sharp, commanding pitch. "What you are looking at is not a standard retail bond. It utilizes a cryptographic indexing method, predating digital mainframes. If you knew anything about the history of your own institution, you would recognize the physical watermark of the original Vanguard Holding Trust. Furthermore, under the Legacy Asset Preservation Act of 1962, you are federally mandated to verify any founder-level equity instrument presented in person. Refusal to process this document is a direct violation of federal banking statutes and grounds for your immediate termination." Kevin froze. The smug smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a flicker of genuine uncertainty. He was a low-level gatekeeper programmed to intimidate the weak, but he had no idea how to handle a data architect who understood the legal framework better than he did. "You have a UV verification scanner bolted right under your keyboard." I continued, my gaze locking onto his terrified eyes. "Turn it on. Place the document under the light. Scan the vertical geometric pattern embedded beneath the signature line. Do your job before I make sure you never work in the financial sector again." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. Mumbling a defensive threat under his breath, he snatched the parchment back. He flipped the switch under his desk. A harsh purple glow illuminated the counter. Kevin slid the old torn paper under the ultraviolet light. The transformation was instantaneous. The invisible barcode ignited in a brilliant, glowing neon green. It was a complex matrix of interlocking lines, a physical manifestation of an early algorithmic cipher. Kevin stared at it, completely paralyzed. He slowly picked up his optical scanner, his hand shaking violently, and dragged the laser across the glowing green pattern. A sharp, piercing beep echoed from his terminal. Instantly, Kevin's primary computer monitor turned pitch black. A second later, a massive flashing red banner dominated the screen. The text was stark white and unmistakable. "Level 1 security override. Executive clearance required." The regular banking interface completely locked down. All transactions on his terminal were frozen. The ambient chatter of the bank lobby seemed to fade into the background as the reality of the situation crashed down upon him. He looked from the flashing red screen to my calm, unwavering face. The color drained entirely from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a ghost in a tailored suit. He realized with horrifying clarity that he had just threatened to call security on someone holding a document that possessed the power to shut down his entire system. "Please," Kevin stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whisper. "Please do not move. Please wait right here. Do not leave this desk." I did not reach for the standard communication radio. Instead, he reached beneath the counter and pulled out a solid red telephone handset. It was the emergency hotline, a direct, unrecorded line straight to the highest tier of regional executive management. His fingers trembled so violently, he could barely grip the plastic receiver as he lifted it to his ear. I stood perfectly still, watching the panic consume him, knowing that the real game was finally about to begin. Exactly 9 minutes passed. I counted every single second on the large digital clock mounted above the exchange boards. Kevin stood frozen behind his desk, holding the red telephone handset against his chest like a shield. He refused to make eye contact with me. The usual morning rush of the bank continued around us, completely oblivious to the silent detonation that had just occurred at the premium services counter. Wealthy clients deposited checks and complained about interest rates entirely, unaware that the foundation of the institution they trusted was currently flashing neon green under a UV scanner. At the 10-minute mark, the brushed steel doors of the private executive elevator slid open with a sharp chime. A man who looked like he had just sprinted down a flight of stairs practically shoved his way through the lobby. This was Bradley, the regional director of North America. I recognized his face from the corporate hierarchy charts I had researched the night before. His custom-tailored suit was immaculate, but his forehead glistened with a thick layer of sweat. He bypassed the security guards entirely and marched straight toward Kevin. Kevin opened his mouth to speak, but Bradley silenced him with a single brutal hand gesture. Bradley stared at the glowing geometric barcode on the torn parchment. He did not touch it. He treated it like an unexploded bomb. He took a deep breath, pulled a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket, wiped his forehead, and finally turned his attention to me. Ms. Stella Bradley said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper to avoid drawing attention from the lobby. Please excuse the delay. My name is Bradley, Regional Director of North America. We need to move this conversation to a secure location immediately. Please follow me. He did not wait for my reply. He turned on his heel and strode back toward the private elevator. I picked up the parchment, slid it carefully back into my manila envelope, and followed him. We bypassed the standard executive suites on the 50th floor and descended deep underground. The elevator doors opened into a subterranean corridor lit by stark white LED panels. Two armed security contractors stood guard outside a massive circular steel door. Bradley placed his hand on a biometric scanner. The heavy steel bolts retracted with a loud mechanical thud. He escorted me inside. This was not a meeting room. It was a reinforced VIP vault designed for viewing physical gold reserves and classified corporate assets. The walls were lined with soundproof acoustic paneling. A single black polished table dominated the center of the room. "Please sit," Bradley commanded, though his voice shook slightly. He took the seat opposite me, leaning forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "Let us drop the pretense. You clearly know this is not a standard life insurance policy." "I know it utilizes an outdated cryptographic ledger system," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "I know it triggered a level 1 security override. You are going to tell me the rest." Bradley swallowed hard. He looked at the manila envelope resting near my hands. "What your grandmother left you is a piece of financial history that was supposed to be destroyed decades ago. In 1960, when Vanguard Financial was incorporated, the original founders issued 5 specific equity contracts to secure initial capital. These were not public shares. They were physical instruments guaranteeing fractional ownership of the entire holding trust. 4 of those contracts were bought back and incinerated during the corporate restructuring of 1985. We assumed the 5th contract was lost in a fire. He pointed a shaking finger at the envelope. "That piece of paper is the 5th founder equity contract. It grants the bearer direct fractional ownership of our core operational assets. It bypasses our modern corporate governance entirely. It is a ghost in our machine." I absorbed the information instantly. My analytical mind processed the scale of what he was saying, while Cassidy was busy racking up credit card debt to buy designer handbags, and DeAndre was running fraudulent investment seminars. My grandmother had been sitting on a financial nuclear weapon. They had treated her like a senile burden. They had mocked her simple lifestyle. They had thrown her ultimate gift into a cemetery trash can. Bradley reached into his suit jacket. "We cannot allow an unregulated equity contract to exist outside our controlled ecosystem. If word leaks that a civilian holds a founder-level instrument, our stock price will hemorrhage within hours. Our shareholders will demand an investigation. We are prepared to offer you an immediate, highly lucrative settlement to surrender the document today." He produced a pristine, embossed corporate checkbook. He clicked a gold pen and hastily scribbled a series of numbers. He tore the check from the binding and slid it across the polished black table. $2 million. Bradley stated, his eyes locking onto mine. "Tax-free. The funds will be cleared and available in a secure offshore account by noon. You walk out of this vault a millionaire, and we take possession of the contract. You sign a non-disclosure agreement, and you never speak of this again. This is more money than you could make in a lifetime of compiling data." I looked down at the check. $2 million. It was an astronomical sum. It was enough to buy a penthouse, travel the world, and never worry about paying rent again. For a brief second, I thought about the power dynamic in my family. $2 million would instantly make me richer than DeAndre and Cassidy combined. But I was not a scared 19-year-old girl begging her father for a student loan anymore. I was a data architect. I understood the value of leverage. If a regional director was willing to write a $2 million check on the spot without consulting his superiors, the actual value of the contract was exponentially higher. He was trying to buy me off for pennies on the dollar. He was treating me with the exact same dismissive arrogance my family had weaponized against me for 33 years. I picked up the check. I held it up so Bradley could see it clearly. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, I tore the thick paper straight down the middle. Bradley gasped, his eyes widening in absolute horror. He half rose from his chair, reaching out as if to stop me. I placed the two torn halves of the check neatly on the table. I leaned back in my leather chair, crossing my arms over my black wool coat. My posture was relaxed, exuding total control. "You must think I am incredibly stupid, Bradley," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You do not hand a $2 million check to a stranger unless the asset they hold threatens your entire power structure. This contract is not a historical novelty. It is a live grenade." Bradley opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was completely out of his depth. "I am not signing a non-disclosure agreement," I continued. "I am not accepting your pocket change. You are going to pick up that red telephone. You are going to connect me directly to the global board of directors. I want a meeting with the people who actually run this empire. And you are going to schedule it for tomorrow morning." I left Bradley standing speechless in the center of the subterranean vault. The heavy steel doors slid shut behind me, sealing him inside with his panic and his shredded $2 million check. I navigated the labyrinth of Vanguard Financial, with my head held high, my posture projecting absolute certainty. My phone vibrated the exact second I stepped onto the bustling Chicago sidewalk. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. Patricia never called me during business hours unless she needed someone to belittle or something to extract. I answered on the third ring. Her voice was sharp, brittle, and commanding, completely devoid of maternal warmth. She ordered me to attend a mandatory family dinner at the North Shore estate that evening. She claimed they had a monumental announcement regarding the future of the family wealth. I agreed to attend. I wanted a front row seat to their delusion. The gates of my childhood home swung open to reveal the sprawling stone mansion. It was a monument to their obsession with status. The manicured hedges and luxury vehicles parked in the circular driveway projected an image of untouchable prosperity. Inside, the reality was distinctly hollow. I handed my black wool coat to the housekeeper and walked into the formal dining room. The mahogany table was set with fine crystal and polished silver. My father, Richard, sat at the head of the table swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. Cassidy lounged in a high-backed chair, checking her flawless manicure. DeAndre stood by the fireplace, practically vibrating with unearned arrogance. Patricia directed me to sit at the far end of the table, the physical distance mirroring our emotional estrangement. We skipped the pleasantries. As soon as the first course was served, Richard tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. He puffed out his chest, looking directly at DeAndre with profound admiration. Richard announced that the family was making a historic pivot. He proudly declared that he and Patricia had taken out a massive secondary mortgage on the entire North Shore estate. They had liquidated every available asset and poured the capital directly into DeAndre's newly launched tech investment portfolio. They were risking the roof over their heads on a man who treated financial markets like a casino. DeAndre took the floor, buttoning his tailored jacket. He launched into a dizzying monologue of fabricated financial jargon. He spoke about decentralized paradigm shifts, agile capital scaling, and disruptive liquidity pools. He threw around buzzwords that made absolutely no mathematical sense. He claimed his proprietary algorithm was going to yield a 400% return by the fourth quarter. He then turned his arrogant gaze toward me. He smirked, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. He told me that my job as a data architect was becoming obsolete. He said compiling raw numbers in a cubicle was peasant work compared to his visionary wealth generation. He actually suggested I take notes on his business model so I might one day understand how real money is made. I sliced a piece of steak and chewed it methodically. I analyzed his linguistic smokescreen. I knew instantly that his revolutionary fund was a catastrophic sinkhole. I was using their mortgaged estate to fund his lavish lifestyle, hiding behind a wall of fake corporate terminology. I let him finish his pathetic performance. Then Patricia leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table. Her smile was predatory and calculated. She explained that because they had injected all their liquid cash into DeAndre's brilliant venture, their monthly cash flow was temporarily restricted. She sighed heavily, playing the part of a struggling aristocrat. The prestigious Oak Brook Country Club annual dues were required by Friday. Her charity gala tables needed to be funded. The maintenance of their social facade required immediate capital. Patricia looked me dead in the eye and demanded I wire $50,000 from my personal savings to her checking account by tomorrow morning. She did not ask. She commanded. She framed it as my fundamental duty to the family. She claimed that since they had provided me with food and shelter during my childhood, it was time for me to pay my debts. Cassidy chimed in, rolling her eyes and stating that since I had no social life and no expensive hobbies, my savings account was just sitting there uselessly anyway. They expected me to bankrupt myself so my mother could continue sipping champagne with socialites while my brother-in-law gambled away their ancestral home. I placed my silver fork down on the porcelain plate. The clink echoed sharply in the silent dining room. I looked at Richard, then at DeAndre, then at Cassidy, and finally at Patricia. "No," I said. The single syllable hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Patricia blinked, completely failing to process my refusal. She asked me to repeat myself, her voice dropping to a dangerous, threatening register. "I will not give you a single dime," I stated clearly. "I am not financing your country club memberships. I am not funding DeAndre's imaginary tech portfolio. You mortgaged your home for a scam, and that is your problem. Do not ever ask me for money again." Patricia erupted. The mask of the refined matriarch shattered instantly. Her face turned an ugly shade of crimson. She slammed her hands onto the table, rattling the expensive crystal. She screamed that I was a useless, ungrateful burden. She called me a jealous, bitter spinster who was intentionally trying to sabotage her sister's happiness. She shrieked that I had never achieved anything of value, that I was a complete disappointment to the family name, and that I would die completely alone. Richard yelled at me to show some respect. DeAndre laughed maliciously, muttering that I was just too broke and pathetic to understand high-level investments. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a tear. Their desperate rage washed over me like rain on concrete. I stood up from the mahogany table. I pushed my chair back, turning my back on their screaming faces. I walked calmly out of the dining room and into the grand foyer. I retrieved my black wool coat from the terrified housekeeper and slipped it over my shoulders. Patricia followed me into the hallway, still shrieking insults, threatening to disown me permanently if I walked out that door. I grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door. At that exact second, my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. A sharp, distinct chime cut through my mother's hysterical screaming. I pulled the phone out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a secure, encrypted email directly from the Chief Legal Counsel of Vanguard Financial. The text was brief and undeniable. "The Global Board of Directors has accepted your terms. A private secure meeting is scheduled for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning at the corporate headquarters. We await your arrival." I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I turned to look at Patricia one last time. Her face was contorted with ugly, desperate rage. I smiled. It was a cold, victorious smile that completely unsettled her. I stepped out into the freezing Chicago night, pulling the door shut behind me, leaving them trapped in a decaying mansion that they no longer truly owned. I stood on the frozen driveway, the crisp air clearing my lungs, and ordered a premium black car to take me back to my apartment. The night passed in a blur of intense strategic preparation. I did not sleep for a single second. I compiled every piece of financial data I had secretly gathered on my arrogant brother-in-law over the past year. By 7 in the morning, I was dressed in a sharp-tailored charcoal suit, ready to execute a hostile takeover of my own life. I arrived at the Vanguard Financial skyscraper precisely at 7:45. The lobby was completely devoid of the usual morning rush swept clean for my arrival. A senior security agent dressed in a tactical suit was already waiting for me by the revolving glass doors. He bypassed the standard security checkpoints, entirely ushering me toward a dedicated glass elevator that required dual biometric scans to operate. We ascended directly to the 85th floor, a level that did not even exist on the public directory. The elevator doors glided open to reveal a massive minimalist boardroom suspended high in the clouds. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, dizzying view of the Chicago skyline, capturing the rising sun over the icy lake. Seated around a massive slab of polished obsidian were the most powerful figures in the global financial sector. There were no low-level gatekeepers here. I immediately recognized the global chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, and the head of international compliance. Bradley, the regional director, who had offered me the pathetic $2 million check yesterday, was nowhere to be seen. He had clearly been deemed far too incompetent to handle a crisis of this magnitude. The global chief executive officer, a sharp-featured man named Harrison, stood up and respectfully gestured toward a plush leather chair at the opposite end of the long table. He did not offer empty pleasantries or fake smiles. He treated me as a dangerous equal, a sudden anomaly that had crashed violently into his meticulously ordered universe. Ms. Stella Harrison began placing his hands flat on the cold obsidian table. Our forensics team worked through the night analyzing the physical and cryptographic markers of your document. It is completely authentic. It is the final outstanding founder equity contract issued during our original corporate incorporation. He pushed a thick leather-bound dossier across the table. I opened it smoothly, my eyes instantly tracking the data. The first page contained a highly detailed spreadsheet calculating 60 years of historical financial adjustments. Harrison explained the complex math with grim, reluctant precision. When my grandmother purchased that bond, it represented a simple fractional share. Over 6 decades, that single share had been subjected to 32 separate stock splits, aggressive dividend reinvestment programs, and compounding interest that had grown unchecked in a dormant shadow account deep within their mainframe. The final number printed in bold black ink at the bottom of the page was absolutely staggering: $45 million. I stared at the page without blinking. $45 million. My family had spent my entire life starving me of affection and resources, intentionally making me feel like a worthless financial burden. They had mocked my career, belittled my intelligence, and demanded my meager savings to fund their pathetic social climbing. Meanwhile, my grandmother had quietly handed me a corporate empire. But the cash value is only half the equation. The chief financial officer interjected, her voice tight with profound anxiety. That specific contract carries an original founder clause. It grants the bearer a permanent, non-dilutable 5% voting block on our global board of directors. You are now the single largest individual shareholder in this entire institution. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the boardroom. Harrison leaned forward, his professional facade cracking just enough to reveal pure, unadulterated desperation. If the global markets discover that an unaccounted 5% voting block has suddenly materialized in the hands of an unknown civilian, our stock price will plummet before the opening bell, Harrison pleaded. Institutional investors despise sudden uncertainty. A drastic shift in our corporate governance will trigger a massive, uncontrollable sell-off. We are looking at a potential market shock that could wipe out billions in shareholder value overnight. We need to formalize your asset, quietly, absorb your voting rights into a blind trust, and issue your $45 million through a series of untraceable shell companies. We are begging you to keep this entirely confidential. I closed the leather dossier slowly. I looked at each of the highly paid executives, letting the silence stretch, forcing them to sweat under the crushing weight of my newfound authority. They were terrified I would walk out and call a major press conference. They fully expected me to be a greedy, short-sighted amateur eager to grab the cash and run. I am a data architect, Harrison. I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a surgical blade. I understand the extreme fragility of market ecosystems. I have no interest in tanking your stock price or parading my new wealth on national television. I will sign your strict non-disclosure agreements. I will allow you to structure the payout quietly. I will keep the existence of this founding contract a total secret. Harrison exhaled a sharp, audible breath of relief, but I immediately raised my hand to stop his celebration. However, I continued leaning forward to match his intensity. My total compliance comes with one absolute non-negotiable condition. The tension slammed right back into the room thicker than before. I require full, unrestricted, administrative-level audit access to a specific shadow investment fund currently managed under your corporate umbrella. I slid a sleek black USB drive across the polished obsidian table. The drive contained the fragmented data I had pieced together about my brother-in-law's fraudulent tech portfolio. The fund is called the Apex Vanguard Initiative. I want every single ledger, every international wire transfer log, and every hidden transaction record associated with that account. The chief financial officer frowned deeply, typing the name into her secure tablet. That is a highly compartmentalized secondary venture fund. It operates on the very fringe of our legal compliance structure. Giving a civilian external audit access violates every privacy protocol we have established. I am not a civilian anymore, I reminded her with a cold, unwavering glare. I am your largest individual shareholder. You give me the unredacted data right now, or I walk out of this skyscraper and hand this story to the Wall Street Journal. Harrison did not hesitate for another second. He looked at the chief financial officer and gave a sharp, definitive nod. Give her the access, he ordered firmly. Give her whatever she wants. I smiled, sliding the USB drive back into my pocket. The trap was officially set. My brother-in-law had built his entire arrogant identity on a massive mountain of financial lies, and I now possessed the exact digital weapon required to obliterate his entire world. A dedicated Vanguard IT specialist escorted me to a windowless, climate-controlled server room on the 72nd floor. The space hummed with the sound of high-capacity cooling units. They handed me a specialized biometric tablet linked directly to their restricted mainframe. I did not waste a single second. I logged into the system, bypassing standard user interfaces and diving straight into the raw database architecture. The Apex Vanguard Initiative was buried under 6 layers of corporate shell companies heavily encrypted to keep low-level auditors completely blind. But they were not dealing with a standard accountant. They had given the keys to a master data architect. I ran a series of complex SQL queries, stripping away the fabricated front-end data. I bypassed the glossy investor presentations and promotional graphics. I wanted the raw, unedited transaction logs. The numbers flooded my screen, cascading in glowing green columns. I tracked the inbound capital injections. My parents' massive wire transfer from their mortgaged North Shore estate was sitting right there, processed just 2 days ago. I followed that specific digital thread, watching where the capital flowed next. It did not go into software development. It did not go into server acquisitions or tech startups. The money bypassed the technology sector entirely. It flowed directly into a series of staggered payout accounts. My eyes scanned the outgoing ledgers. The financial structure was blatantly obvious. It was an incredibly sophisticated, modernized Ponzi scheme. The Apex Vanguard Initiative was taking fresh capital from new investors and using it to pay artificially inflated dividends to early backers. There was no proprietary algorithm. There was no disruptive technology. It was a classic pyramid scam wrapped in Silicon Valley buzzwords, designed to bleed wealthy, gullible suburbanites dry. The entire fund was a hollow shell balancing precariously on the constant influx of new victims. I dug deeper, my fingers flying across the tablet keyboard. I cross-referenced the investor recruitment logs with the commission payout structures. I wanted to see exactly how my arrogant brother-in-law had been suckered into this massive fraud. I assumed DeAndre was simply an arrogant fool who had fallen for a flashy presentation. I assumed his ego had blinded him to the mathematical impossibilities of the returns he was bragging about. I was completely wrong. The truth was far more sinister. I found a hidden subledger labeled with a distinct alphanumeric code. I ran a decryption script on the file translating the anonymized data into clear text. A list of external recruiting agents populated the screen. DeAndre was sitting right at the top of the list. He was not a victim. He was a primary architect of the local fraud ring. I opened his specific transaction history, my blood running cold, at the sheer magnitude of his betrayal. DeAndre held a platinum-tier recruitment contract with the Apex Vanguard Fund. For every new investor he brought into the scheme, he received a staggering 20% cash commission skimmed directly off the top of their initial deposit. The funds were automatically routed to a hidden offshore account in the Cayman Islands, registered under an untraceable LLC. I pulled up the exact timestamp of my parents' massive mortgage transfer. Richard and Patricia had wired $2.5 million to the fund, risking their entire ancestral home on DeAndre's recommendation. The data log showed that exactly 3 seconds after their wire cleared, $500,000 was automatically diverted into DeAndre's secret offshore account. He had actively convinced my parents to bankrupt themselves, and he had pocketed $500,000 of their money as a reward. My mind raced as I pulled up his broader recruitment portfolio. DeAndre had not stopped with my parents. The ledger showed dozens of victims. He had systematically targeted his own extended family, his college fraternity brothers, and his elite social club members. He hosted lavish dinner parties and golf outings, using his proximity to my family's perceived wealth to project an image of untouchable financial genius. He weaponized their trust, convincing them to liquidate their retirement accounts and college savings plans to invest in the Apex Vanguard initiative. With every friend and relative he pushed into the meat grinder, his hidden offshore balance grew exponentially. How was a financial predator feeding on his own community? His entire lifestyle, the custom-tailored suits, the luxury sports cars, the expensive whiskey was entirely funded by the stolen savings of people who trusted him. He knew the tech fund was a total scam. He knew it was mathematically destined to collapse and wipe out everyone involved. He simply did not care as long as he extracted his 20% commission before the pyramid fell apart. I sat back in the ergonomic chair, the hum of the server room filling the silence. The sheer scale of his sociopathy was breathtaking. My mother had screamed at me for refusing to hand over my modest savings, completely unaware that her golden son-in-law had just robbed her blind. They had treated me like a worthless spinster while rolling out the red carpet for a ruthless con artist. I did not feel anger. I felt absolute icy clarity. I now possessed the exact weapon required to dismantle his life. I connected my encrypted flash drive to the terminal. I began systematically downloading every single piece of evidence. I pulled the wire transfer receipts, the offshore account routing numbers, the signed recruitment contracts, and the internal emails detailing his knowledge of the Ponzi structure. I captured the definitive proof that he had intentionally targeted my parents and skimmed their mortgage funds. I compiled a bulletproof digital dossier, organizing the data into a chronological narrative of federal wire fraud and grand larceny. I categorized the files so perfectly that any rookie FBI agent could secure a conviction within 10 minutes of reading them. The evidence was irrefutable. There were no loopholes, no legal gray areas, and absolutely no way for DeAndre to claim ignorance. He had signed his own name on the commission transfers. He had left a massive digital footprint linking him directly to the stolen capital. I ejected the flash drive and slipped it safely into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. The weight of the small device felt incredibly satisfying. I wiped my search history from the Vanguard terminal, ensuring no one could track the specific files I had extracted. I stood up, smoothed out my jacket, and walked out of the server room. The corporate security guards nodded respectfully as I passed, entirely unaware that I was carrying enough financial dynamite to obliterate dozens of prominent lives. I stepped out of the skyscraper and into the bustling Chicago afternoon. The cold wind whipped across the street, but I felt comfortably warm. I hailed a premium car service and directed the driver to my apartment. I needed to prepare for the inevitable fallout. DeAndre's fraudulent fund was currently facing a severe liquidity crisis, unable to secure enough new victims to pay off the older investors. The entire pyramid was starting to crack under its own weight. I knew it was only a matter of time before the panic set in. I knew exactly who they would come to when the money stopped flowing. I arrived at my apartment, locked the deadbolt, and booted up my private workstation. I uploaded the encrypted dossier to 3 separate secure cloud servers, ensuring the data could never be destroyed. I synced my high-definition security cameras to a dedicated recording server. The trap was fully constructed, armed, and ready to trigger. I made myself a cup of black coffee and sat by the window watching the sun dip below the city skyline. The waiting game had begun. I knew they would not wait long. Desperation always breeds reckless behavior. The digital clock on my kitchen counter flashed exactly midnight. The heavy, comforting silence of my apartment was suddenly shattered by a violent, frantic pounding on my front door. The heavy wooden frame rattled against the deadbolt. The blows were sharp, desperate, and relentless. I did not flinch. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, set the ceramic mug down on the granite counter, and walked calmly toward the entryway. I tapped the screen of my wall-mounted security interface. The high-definition night vision camera, positioned in the hallway outside my door, flickered to life. The crystal-clear audio feed piped directly into my living room. DeAndre and Cassidy were standing under the harsh fluorescent hallway lights. The transformation in their appearance was absolutely staggering. Just 48 hours ago at the cemetery, DeAndre had been a picture of untouchable corporate arrogance in a bespoke Italian suit. Now he looked like a cornered animal. His expensive dress shirt was completely soaked in sweat, the collar unbuttoned, and his silk tie hanging crookedly around his neck. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and darting nervously down the empty corridor. Cassidy looked even worse. She had clearly not slept. Her designer mascara was heavily smudged beneath her eyes, and her hands shook violently as she clutched a luxury leather handbag against her chest. "Open the door!" Stella DeAndre shouted, his voice cracking with unfiltered panic. He slammed his fist against the wood again. "We know you are in there. Open the door right now. We have a massive family emergency." I did not unlock the deadbolt. I pressed the two-way intercom button on my security panel. My voice echoed cleanly into the hallway, cool and entirely devoid of emotion. "State your business," I said. DeAndre jumped at the sound of my voice. He leaned directly into the camera lens, his face slick with perspiration. "Stella, listened to me very carefully. I am dealing with a temporary liquidity crisis. It is a minor cash flow hiccup due to some unexpected international market volatility. I have a margin call that requires immediate capital clearing by tomorrow morning at the opening bell. I need $500,000 in liquid cash to stabilize my primary investment accounts." How was drowning in federal wire fraud, his Ponzi scheme collapsing under its own weight, yet he was still attempting to use fake corporate jargon to mask his absolute ruin. "That sounds like a terrible personal problem," I replied through the intercom. "It has absolutely nothing to do with me. Go back to your mansion and leave my property before I call the building security." Cassidy shoved her husband aside, pressing her face against the doorframe. Her expression was a terrifying mix of entitlement and pure malice. "You listen to me, you worthless spinster!" Cassidy shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly down the apartment building corridor. "You are going to log into your bank right now and initiate a wire transfer. We know you live like a total hermit. We know you have zero debt and a pristine credit score. You are going to take out a high-yield personal loan against your data architecture salary, and you are going to bail out your family. DeAndre just needs a bridge loan for a few weeks. You owe us." "I owe you absolutely nothing," I stated flatly. "You threw our grandmother's final gift into a cemetery trash can and laughed in my face. You drained my parents' mortgage into a fraudulent account. You are both standing on the edge of a financial cliff, and I am highly enjoying the view." Cassidy's face twisted into an ugly, vicious snarl. She realized her demands were failing, so she immediately pivoted to her favorite weapon. She moved to outright calculated extortion. "If you do not open this door and transfer the funds right now, I am calling the Chicago Police Department," Cassidy threatened, pointing a shaking finger directly at my security camera. "I am going to file a sworn official police report stating that you looted Grandma Beatrice's estate. I will tell the detectives that you stole her antique diamond brooches and her vintage silver collection during the house cleanup. I will bruise my own arms right here in this hallway and swear to the officers that you physically assaulted me when I tried to stop you. I will have you arrested for grand larceny and domestic battery. Your precious data career will be completely destroyed by morning." I smiled. It was a cold, clinical smile. I glanced at the top right corner of my security interface. A bright red circle blinked steadily, confirming that the recording system was actively capturing every single frame of video and every single decibel of audio. They had just handed me a flawless high-definition recording of felony extortion, attempted blackmail, and a conspiracy to commit perjury. My bulletproof digital dossier was growing stronger by the minute. I released the intercom button. I reached onto the entryway table and picked up a piece of paper I had prepared earlier that evening. It was a cheap, low-resolution black-and-white photocopy of the torn 1960 Founder Equity Bond. It was printed on standard printer paper lacking any of the cryptographic watermarks, the red wax seal, or the hidden UV barcode. It was entirely worthless. I disengaged the heavy deadbolt with a loud click. DeAndre and Cassidy instantly stepped back, expecting me to surrender. I opened the door exactly 2 inches, keeping the solid steel security chain firmly engaged. The cold draft from the hallway swept into my apartment. I looked at their desperate, greedy faces through the narrow crack. "You want a bailout?" I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "Here is your family inheritance." I shoved the crumpled black and white photocopy through the opening. DeAndre snatched it from my fingers with blinding speed, his eyes wide with frantic, unearned hope. He unfolded the cheap paper, his hands trembling as he stared at the faded ink and the torn corner. He recognized the text from the cemetery. He believed I had surrendered the only asset I possessed. He believed I was handing over a historical bond that he could somehow leverage or liquidate to save his collapsing fraud ring. "Take it to the bank!" I instructed, my tone dripping with absolute contempt. Before either of them could utter another word, I slammed the heavy wooden door shut with shattering force. The sound echoed like a gunshot. I threw the deadbolt back into place and engaged the secondary floor lock. I turned back to my security monitor. DeAndre and Cassidy were standing in the hallway, greedily examining the worthless photocopy. DeAndre muttered something to his wife, folding the paper carefully and shoving it into his suit pocket. They practically sprinted down the corridor toward the elevator, completely convinced they had just bullied me into handing over their salvation. They had no idea they were holding a piece of trash that would trigger their ultimate destruction. I walked back to my kitchen counter, picked up my black coffee, and took a long, satisfying sip. I knew exactly where they were going to be when the doors of Vanguard Financial opened in the morning. The sun had barely risen over the Chicago skyline when DeAndre and Cassidy pulled up to the Vanguard Financial Tower. They had not slept a single minute. Fueled by a toxic cocktail of sheer desperation and unearned arrogance, they stormed through the revolving glass doors the moment the security team unlocked them for regular business hours. They bypassed the velvet ropes and the stanchions meant for everyday retail customers. DeAndre marched directly toward the premium services counter, his designer dress shoes slapping aggressively against the polished marble floor. He was clutching the cheap black and white photocopy of the torn insurance policy as if it were a winning lottery ticket. He slammed his fist down on the counter, startling a junior bank teller who had just logged into his terminal. DeAndre demanded an immediate audience with the highest-ranking executive in the building. He shouted that he held a historical founder equity contract and required an instant multi-million-dollar liquidity transfer to cover his margin calls. Cassidy stood right beside him, crossing her arms and tapping her foot impatiently. She shrieked at the bewildered teller to stop staring and do his job. She loudly proclaimed that her family held elite status and that any delay would result in massive lawsuits. The volume of their screaming echoed across the cavernous lobby, drawing the attention of wealthy clients and heavily armed security contractors. 2 guards dressed in tactical suits immediately stepped away from the main entrance and positioned themselves behind DeAndre. They ordered him to lower his voice and step away from the premium desk. DeAndre sneered at them. He puffed out his chest, attempting to use his physical presence and his fabricated corporate alpha persona to intimidate the guards. He waved the crumpled piece of printer paper in the air, screaming that he possessed the power to buy and sell every single person standing in that lobby. The chaotic scene was abruptly silenced by the sharp, unmistakable chime of the private executive elevator. The heavy brushed steel doors slid open. Bradley, the regional director of North America, stepped out into the lobby. Just yesterday, Bradley had been a sweating, terrified mess when confronted with the actual encrypted document. Today, he was the absolute picture of ruthless corporate authority. He buttoned his custom-tailored suit jacket and walked deliberately toward the premium counter. The security guards parted respectfully to let him through. Bradley did not look intimidated. He looked profoundly annoyed. DeAndre recognized the executive authority radiating from Bradley. He shoved the junior teller aside and thrust the piece of paper directly toward the regional director. DeAndre launched into a frantic rapid-fire pitch. He demanded an emergency bridge loan using the historical bond as collateral. He tried to sound like a Wall Street insider, throwing around meaningless terms about collateralized debt obligations and high-frequency liquidity injections. He demanded that Bradley process the transaction immediately before the opening bell of the stock market. Bradley did not flinch. He did not call for the emergency ultraviolet scanner. He did not summon the biometric tablet. He simply looked down at the paper in DeAndre's trembling hand. He let out a harsh, dry laugh that echoed clearly across the quiet marble lobby. Bradley reached out and pinched the edge of the paper. He held it up to the bright lobby lights, exposing the cheap, grainy pixelation of the standard printer ink. He looked DeAndre dead in the eye with a gaze entirely devoid of human empathy. "You must be completely out of your mind," Bradley stated, his voice cutting through the air like a razor blade. "You march into my global headquarters screaming at my staff, and you hand me a low-resolution photocopy printed on standard 20-pound copy paper. There is no cryptographic watermark. There is no embedded matrix barcode. There is no original red wax seal. You are holding a literal piece of garbage." DeAndre's face drained of color. He stuttered aggressively, insisting that the document was real, that it was a family inheritance, that it held immense historical value. Cassidy stepped forward, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch, demanding that Bradley stop playing games and hand over their money. Bradley dropped the cheap photocopy onto the marble floor. It fluttered down, landing directly next to DeAndre's expensive leather shoes. "That asset is completely worthless to you," Bradley announced, projecting his voice so every security guard and high-net-worth client in the lobby could hear the absolute humiliation. The authentic, original version of that founder equity contract was presented, verified, and fully executed in my private vault yesterday morning. The rightful owner claimed a $45 million payout and assumed a massive voting block on our global board of directors. The asset is gone. You are holding a fake picture of a cashed-out check." Cassidy let out a piercing shriek of pure disbelief. Her knees buckled slightly as the mathematical reality of what I had done finally crashed into her brain. She realized that I had already secured the fortune while she was busy threatening me with fake police reports. DeAndre's mouth opened and closed in silent terror. The bridge loan he desperately needed to save his fraudulent tech portfolio was a complete illusion. He was completely out of options. He lunged forward, slamming his hands onto the premium counter, screaming that the bank had stolen his family money and demanding to know the identity of the new billionaire shareholder. Bradley did not tolerate another second of their manic behavior. He gave a short, sharp nod to the tactical security team. "Remove these trespassers from my building," Bradley ordered coldly. "If they resist, call the Chicago Police Department and have them booked for causing a public disturbance." The two massive security contractors moved with brutal efficiency. They grabbed DeAndre by the arms of his tailored suit, twisting his wrists behind his back. DeAndre thrashed and cursed, screaming that he was a brilliant investment manager and that he would have them all fired. A third guard secured Cassidy by the elbow, ignoring her hysterical screaming about her social status. The wealthy clients in the lobby watched in disgusted fascination as the two perfectly dressed scammers were physically dragged across the pristine marble floor. The guards shoved them through the revolving glass doors and violently threw them out onto the freezing Chicago concrete. DeAndre stumbled hard, scraping his hands and his expensive suit pants against the rough pavement. Cassidy landed on her knees, her luxury leather handbag spilling its contents across the dirty sidewalk. The heavy security doors locked automatically behind them, shutting them out of the financial fortress forever. DeAndre scrambled to his knees, gasping for breath in the freezing air. He frantically reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He needed to call his offshore bank. He needed to move whatever stolen capital he had left before his angry investors realized the Apex Vanguard initiative was bankrupt. The exact second he unlocked his screen, the device vibrated violently in his palm. A glaring red notification banner dominated his display. It was an automated high-priority alert generated directly from the Vanguard institutional banking server. DeAndre stared at the glowing text, his heart stopping completely in his chest. The alert was unmistakable. His primary corporate accounts, his offshore holding trusts, and the entire financial infrastructure of his tech portfolio were permanently frozen. A secondary notification popped up immediately beneath it. The text clearly stated that all capital access was revoked, pending an active federal investigation for criminal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and aggravated money laundering. The digital guillotine had dropped. His entire empire of lies had just been eradicated. DeAndre stared at the glowing red screen of his smartphone, his chest heaving as the freezing Chicago wind bit through his ruined designer suit. The notification confirming a federal investigation for wire fraud was the final nail in his coffin. He looked up at Cassidy, who was still kneeling on the dirty sidewalk, gathering her spilled makeup. The illusion of their elite status was dead. They needed a scapegoat to survive the incoming legal storm, and they needed one immediately. They dragged themselves back to the North Shore mansion where Patricia was waiting. The moment DeAndre revealed his accounts were frozen, Patricia completely panicked. Her country club dues, her charity galas, and her entire aristocratic identity were tied to that fraudulent money. Instead of holding DeAndre accountable for running a Ponzi scheme, Patricia and Cassidy turned their collective rage toward the only target they had ever known. They decided to destroy me. By noon, they had set up a camera in the mansion's opulent living room. Patricia and Cassidy sat close together on an antique sofa, looking deliberately disheveled and devastated. They recorded a 10-minute video designed to manipulate the emotions of every wealthy socialite in their network. Cassidy squeezed out fake tears, her voice trembling as she delivered a perfectly scripted lie. She claimed I was a bitter sociopathic hacker who had spent years plotting against our family. Patricia looked directly into the camera lens and accused me of horrifying crimes. She stated that I had isolated Grandma Beatrice, subjecting her to severe emotional and financial abuse. Patricia claimed I had coerced a dying woman into signing over her hidden assets, stealing the family inheritance out of pure malice. DeAndre stayed off camera, but his fabricated narrative drove the second half of the video. Cassidy sobbed, alleging that I had used my high-level data architecture skills to illegally breach Vanguard Financial's mainframes. She told their audience that I had planted false transaction records to frame her innocent husband for corporate sabotage, deliberately freezing his legitimate investment fund out of spite. It was a masterpiece of character assassination. They uploaded the highly edited video to every major social media platform. They tagged the Oak Brook Country Club community pages, local Chicago neighborhood watch groups, and prominent business networking sites. The algorithm rewarded their manufactured drama. Within 2 hours, the video had amassed tens of thousands of views. The comment sections exploded with absolute outrage. Women my mother played tennis with called me a monster. DeAndre's former investors, entirely unaware that he had actually stolen their money, demanded I be arrested for hacking his accounts. My professional network was flooded with aggressive messages. Former high school classmates shared the post, adding their own fabricated stories about how strange and unsettling I had always been. The digital mob was hunting for blood. I sat at the granite counter of my apartment, sipping a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. I watched the view count on their video climb higher and higher on my encrypted tablet. My phone vibrated endlessly with notifications, hate mail, and death threats from strangers who believed my family's performance. A normal person would have been completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of public hatred. A normal person would have immediately drafted a frantic emotional response, begging the internet to believe their innocence. I did not type a single word of defense. I did not post a counter video. I did not engage with a single comment. I simply took another sip of my coffee. They thought they were burying my reputation. They did not realize they had just handed me irrefutable documented proof of malicious defamation. I picked up my phone and dialed a highly secure number. I was no longer a lone data architect fighting a wealthy family. I was a billionaire shareholder with unlimited capital. I connected directly to the senior partner of a top-tier corporate crisis management firm located in Washington. I instructed him to mobilize an entire digital forensics team immediately. I gave them a specific set of directives. They were not to issue any public denials. Instead, they were ordered to archive every single frame of that video. I wanted the metadata extracted. I wanted the IP addresses tracked. I wanted every timestamp, every platform upload log, and every single share documented and preserved on a secure legal server. I watched my screen as my hired technicians went to work. They systematically captured the digital footprints of Patricia Cassidy and DeAndre. They legally bound the trio to their own lies. Next, I opened a video conference with my newly appointed legal team funded by my massive Vanguard payout. The lead litigator, a ruthless courtroom veteran, reviewed the archived social media posts with a grim smile. The video my family uploaded met every single legal criterion for aggravated libel and intentional infliction of emotional distress. They had publicly accused me of elder abuse and federal cybercrimes without a single shred of evidence. By attempting to incite a digital mob, they had opened themselves up to a devastating civil lawsuit. My lawyer confirmed that we could easily sue them for millions in punitive damages. The trap was widening perfectly. DeAndre was already facing federal prison for wire fraud, and now Patricia and Cassidy had willingly tied their own nooses. They believed their social media campaign would force me into hiding. They thought public pressure would compel me to unfreeze DeAndre's accounts and hand over my grandmother's fortune to stop the harassment. They were playing a loud, messy game of public relations while I was quietly constructing an inescapable legal prison. The digital evidence was locked, sealed, and ready to deploy at the exact moment it would cause maximum destruction. They had thrown the first punch in the public arena, but I was going to deliver the final, crushing blow in a federal courtroom. The timer was officially ticking. Every single malicious comment they approved only added another layer of concrete to the cell they were actively building. The timer was officially ticking. Every single malicious comment they approved only added another layer of concrete to the cell they were actively building. But DeAndre was not waiting quietly for the concrete to dry. A predator backed into a corner will always try to claw its way out, and he was hunting for one final massive lifeline. His Vanguard accounts were frozen, his investors were beginning to ask dangerous questions, and his liquidity was completely non-existent. I needed an 8-figure capital injection immediately to fabricate a bridge loan, pay off the loudest complaints, and secure enough untraceable cash to vanish. He leveraged the absolute last drops of his fabricated professional reputation to secure a pitch meeting with Apex Sterling Capital, one of the most ruthless and heavily funded venture capital firms in the Midwest. Apex Sterling Capital operated out of a pristine glass-walled penthouse overlooking the Chicago River. They managed billions in private equity, but they relied heavily on Vanguard Financial as their primary institutional liquidity provider. When Vanguard's executive board informed them that their largest individual shareholder wished to personally sit in on the morning pitch session as a proxy observer, the venture capital partners agreed without hesitation. They had no idea who I was, but they respected the $45 million and the 5% voting block I commanded. I arrived 20 minutes early, reviewing the pitch deck DeAndre had submitted in advance. It was a masterpiece of corporate fiction. He was asking for $20 million, promising a revolutionary algorithmic trading model that supposedly generated risk-free arbitrage opportunities. I sat in a high-backed leather chair at the far end of the sprawling mahogany table, deliberately positioned in the shadows, away from the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The senior partners filed in, taking their seats, adjusting their luxury watches, and reviewing their secure tablets. Precisely at 9 o'clock, the double-glass doors swung open. DeAndre strutted into the room. He had purchased a brand-new charcoal suit on credit, trying to project the image of an untouchable tech visionary. He flashed his signature, charismatic smile, shaking hands with the partners, exuding a desperate manic energy. He set up his presentation, completely oblivious to my presence at the far end of the long table. He launched into his pitch, pacing back and forth, waving his hands, and projecting his voice with practiced theatricality. He spewed the exact same fraudulent jargon he had used at my parents' dining table. He talked about decentralized ledgers, dynamic capital scaling, and proprietary liquidity pools. He clicked to his second slide, showcasing a graph with an explosive upward trending profit margin. He promised the partners a guaranteed 300% return on their $20 million investment within 18 months. He smiled broadly, waiting for the applause. I leaned forward, bringing my face into the bright morning light, reflecting off the polished mahogany table. Your dynamic capital scaling model is structurally flawed, I stated, my voice echoing sharply against the acoustic glass walls. DeAndre froze mid-breath. His head snapped toward my voice. The confident, charismatic smile slid right off his face, replaced by a mask of absolute, unadulterated terror. He blinked rapidly, his mind failing to process the visual information. I was not wearing my plain black wool coat. I was dressed in an immaculate, tailored navy suit, projecting a level of executive authority he could only dream of possessing. The senior partners all turned to look at me, deferring to the representative from Vanguard. Stella. DeAndre choked out, his voice cracking violently. "What are you doing here? You do not work for Apex." "I represent the primary liquidity provider for this firm," I replied coldly, interlocking my fingers on the table. "I am here to ensure they do not waste $20 million on a modernized Ponzi scheme." A collective murmur of shock rippled through the senior partners. DeAndre's face turned an ashen gray. He frantically tried to recover his composure, forcing a weak, trembling laugh. "Gentlemen, please excuse this," DeAndre stammered, looking wildly at the venture capitalists. "This is my wife's sister. She has a personal vendetta against my family. She is a low-level data entry clerk who knows absolutely nothing about high finance. I demand security remove her from this building immediately." The lead partner, an older man with piercing blue eyes, frowned deeply. "She is a fully authorized PI, representing our largest institutional backer. You will address her with total respect, or we will end this meeting right now." DeAndre swallowed hard, panic visibly rising in his chest. I did not give him another second to breathe. I tapped the tablet in front of me wirelessly, overriding his presentation screen. His fabricated profit graph vanished, replaced by the raw, unedited transaction logs I had extracted from the Vanguard server room. "Let us look at slide 3. I commanded, projecting the data onto the massive wall monitor. "You claim your algorithm generates risk-free arbitrage. But this raw ledger shows that your inbound capital injections are never routed to any technology sector. The funds are immediately diverted into a series of staggered payout accounts. You are simply taking new money from gullible investors and using it to pay artificially inflated dividends to your early backers. This is not agile scaling. This is a textbook pyramid fraud." DeAndre gripped the edge of the podium, his knuckles turning white. "That data is fabricated," he shouted desperately. "You hacked into my personal servers and altered the numbers. I pulled these directly from the Vanguard institutional mainframe under executive audit clearance." I countered, my voice slicing through his lies. I swiped to the next slide. "Now let us examine your offshore liquidity pools." A new document illuminated the room. It was the hidden subledger detailing his personal recruitment commissions. The senior partners leaned in, their eyes narrowing as they scrutinized the undeniable evidence of federal wire fraud. "This is your platinum-tier recruitment contract," I explained, addressing the stunned executives. "For every new victim he brings into this collapsing fund, He skims a 20% cash commission directly off the top of their initial deposit. The funds are automatically routed to a hidden offshore account in the Cayman Islands registered under an untraceable LLC. The exact routing numbers are displayed on the screen. DeAndre was physically trembling now. Sweat poured down his face, ruining his expensive collar. The venture capitalists stared at him with pure disgust. They were sharks, but they operated within the boundaries of legal corporate warfare. They did not tolerate blatant theft, and they certainly did not tolerate a desperate con artist trying to steal $20 million from their reserves. "I can explain," DeAndre begged, his voice dropping to a pathetic whine. "The offshore accounts are standard tax mitigation structures. The payouts are temporary bridge loans. It is all perfectly legal." "Is that why Vanguard Financial officially froze your entire portfolio yesterday morning?" I asked, delivering the final fatal strike. "Is that why you are currently under an active federal investigation for aggravated money laundering?" The room went dead silent. The lead partner slammed his notebook shut with a definitive, aggressive thud. He stood up, towering over the crumbling fraudster. "We are done here," the lead partner declared with absolute finality. "Do not ever contact this firm again. You are blacklisted from every venture capital network in the Midwest. If you do not leave this premises in 30 seconds, I will personally call the federal authorities and hold you in this room until they arrive." DeAndre looked like a man who had just been hit by a freight train. His breathing was shallow and erratic. He looked at the executives, then at the undeniable evidence glowing on the screen, and finally at me. He expected to see the quiet, submissive scapegoat his family had tormented for decades. Instead, he saw a predator who had just systematically dismantled his entire existence. He grabbed his briefcase with shaking hands, abandoning his presentation materials. He turned and practically ran out of the glass boardroom, his designer shoes echoing frantically down the corridor. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind him, sealing his professional tomb. I remained seated, calmly sipping my water. The industry elite had just witnessed an absolute slaughter, and they looked at me with a newfound profound respect. The first pillar of my family's toxic empire had been completely eradicated, and I was just getting started. I walked out of the Apex Sterling Capital penthouse, leaving the venture capitalists to murmur among themselves. The destruction of DeAndre was mathematically complete. By noon, the financial contagion spread precisely as my data models predicted. With his Vanguard accounts locked and his venture capital prospects obliterated, the secondary lenders panicked. The massive loan my parents had secured against their ancestral North Shore estate was directly tied to DeAndre's fraudulent portfolio. When the automated clearinghouse flagged his primary accounts for federal wire fraud, the bank initiated an immediate aggressive foreclosure protocol. The default notices were dispatched electronically and physically by certified mail. My parents had exactly zero liquid capital to halt the process. Most people facing sudden catastrophic homelessness would immediately begin packing their belongings or securing legal representation. Patricia and Richard were not most people. Their entire existence was built on the fragile perception of aristocratic superiority. Facing absolute ruin, my mother chose the path of pure, unadulterated delusion. She decided the best way to combat the whispers circulating through the Oak Brook Country Club was to throw a lavish, wildly expensive garden party. She maxed out her final active credit cards to hire a premium catering service, a classical string quartet, and a team of professional valets. She ordered hundreds of imported white roses to decorate the sprawling back lawn of the estate they technically no longer owned. Her strategy was an exercise in pathetic denial. She invited every wealthy socialite, every local politician, and every prominent business owner in their network. Patricia planned to gather the elite of Chicago society on her manicured lawn and formally announced that DeAndre was actually launching an exclusive international expansion of his tech fund. She believed that projecting an image of overwhelming success would somehow magically fix their bank accounts and silence the rumors of his federal investigation. I monitored the catering deposits and event rentals through the financial tracking tools my Vanguard connections provided. Watching my mother buy expensive champagne while a foreclosure notice sat on her mahogany dining table, was a fascinating study in psychological collapse. I knew I had to be there. I needed to witness the exact moment her fabricated reality collided with absolute destruction. I did not wear my plain black wool coat this time. I selected a striking, tailored crimson dress that exuded uncompromising authority. I paired it with diamond stud earrings I had purchased with a tiny fraction of my initial Vanguard payout. I looked like a woman who owned the world because I practically did. I hired a private chauffeur to drive me to the North Shore mansion. The winding streets of my childhood neighborhood were choked with luxury sedans and sports cars. The valets were working frantically to park the vehicles of Chicago's elite. My driver pulled the sleek black car right up to the front entrance. I stepped out onto the cobblestone driveway. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the pristine property. I could hear the elegant music of the string quartet drifting from the backyard, mingling with the obnoxious fake laughter of wealthy guests drinking unpaid champagne. I bypassed the main entrance and walked purposefully along the flagstone path leading to the sprawling back lawn. The scene was sickeningly perfect. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with silver trays of expensive appetizers. Cassidy was standing near a towering floral arrangement, wearing a designer silk gown, laughing too loudly, and gripping a crystal flute of champagne. Her eyes were darting nervously around the crowd. DeAndre was nowhere to be seen, likely hiding inside the mansion, terrified that federal agents might crash the party. Patricia was holding court near the center of the lawn, wearing an oversized sun hat and projecting the false confidence of a seasoned aristocrat. I stepped onto the manicured grass. My crimson dress instantly caught the attention of several guests. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The socialites who had watched my family's malicious smear campaign video recognized me instantly. They stared at me, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. I did not shrink away. I maintained a posture of total dominance, walking straight toward the center of the gathering. My father Richard was standing near the outdoor bar, trying to impress a local city councilman. He glanced over his shoulder and saw me cutting through the crowd. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple. The polite, wealthy patriarch mask vanished in a millisecond. He excused himself abruptly, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles jumping in his cheek. He marched directly toward me, intercepting me before I could reach Patricia. Stella Richard hissed, his voice dropping to a furious, barely contained whisper so the nearby guests would not hear. "What are you doing here? You are completely uninvited. You have caused enough damage to this family. Turn around and walk back down that driveway before I have you arrested for trespassing." I stopped and looked him directly in the eyes. "I am enjoying the party, Richard. It is a beautiful afternoon to celebrate massive financial fraud, do you not agree?" His eyes widened in rage. "You are a psychotic, bitter woman," he spat. "DeAndre is securing a multi-million-dollar international expansion as we speak. Your mother is about to make the official announcement. We are celebrating the future of this family. You are nothing but a jealous failure trying to ruin your sister's happiness. Get off my property." I smiled a cold, calculating smile. "This is not your property anymore, Richard. The bank foreclosed on this estate at 9 o'clock this morning. You are currently hosting a catered event on foreclosed land." Richard refused to absorb the truth. His denial was impenetrable. He raised his hand and violently signaled to the head of the valet team, standing near the side gate. Two large men in uniform vests jogged over immediately. Richard pointed a shaking finger at me. "This woman is trespassing and harassing my guests," Richard ordered, loudly, abandoning his whispered tone. The music from the string quartet seemed to falter as guests turned to watch the commotion. "Grab her by the arms and throw her off my estate. If she struggles, call the police. I want her physically removed from the premises right now." The two valets stepped forward, their hands reaching out to grab my shoulders. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I simply stood my ground on the pristine grass, waiting for the real guest of honor to arrive. The valet's hands were inches from my shoulders when the deafening roar of a heavy engine shattered the polite ambiance of the garden party. A massive armored black SUV blew past the front gates, entirely ignoring the designated parking zones and the frantic shouts of the event staff. The driver did not touch the brakes. The heavy vehicle tore directly onto the pristine, manicured back lawn, crushing Patricia's expensive imported white roses beneath its thick, aggressive tires. Mud and shredded grass flew into the air, splattering against the crisp white tablecloths of the catering stations. The string quartet stopped playing instantly, their bows freezing midair as a chorus of alarmed gasps erupted from the wealthy guests. The two valets who had been ordered to remove me immediately backed away, raising their hands in surrender. Richard turned an explosive shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. He marched toward the SUV, his fists clenched at his sides, screaming at the top of his lungs about property damage, trespassing, and immediate police intervention. He demanded the driver step out and face a $1 million lawsuit. The driver's side door swung open heavily. A tall, impeccably dressed man, wearing a sharp charcoal suit and wire-rimmed glasses, stepped out onto the ruined grass. He carried a thick, red-sealed legal folder under his arm. This was Jonathan Pierce, the Senior Asset Management Director for the Central Banking Authority of Chicago. He did not look intimidated by my father's screaming. He looked like a corporate executioner arriving to deliver a fatal blow. Richard stopped in his tracks, recognizing the emblem of the central bank pinned to Jonathan's lapel. The blustering, arrogant patriarch suddenly looked very small. Jonathan calmly raised a hand, silencing my father instantly with the sheer crushing weight of his corporate authority. He did not offer a polite greeting. He did not apologize for the ruined lawn. He simply extended his arm and pressed the thick red folder directly against Richard's chest. This is the final non-negotiable foreclosure execution and immediate writ of possession, Jonathan announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent yard. The grace period has officially expired. This property is no longer under your jurisdiction. Richard's hands shook violently as he ripped open the folder. His eyes darted across the dense legal jargon, searching desperately for a loophole, a mistake, or a delay tactic. There was none. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to lean against a stone birdbath to keep from collapsing onto the mud. The paper confirmed the absolute nightmare I had promised him just minutes ago. The estate was gone. Patricia rushed over, her oversized sun hat knocked askew. She grabbed Richard's arm, demanding to know what the document said, shrieking that there had to be a banking error. Jonathan ignored her frantic, high-pitched questions entirely. He pivoted away from my crumbling parents, straightened his suit jacket, and walked directly toward me. The entire garden party fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The local politicians, the business owners, and the cruel socialites held their breath, watching the highest-ranking banking official on the property approach, the woman they had all just been mocking. Jonathan stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. He placed his hands by his sides and bowed respectfully, a gesture of absolute, unquestionable professional submission. "Ms. Stella," Jonathan said, projecting his voice so perfectly that every single person on the lawn could hear the monumental shift in power. "I am pleased to inform you that your private holding company has successfully acquired the entirety of this estate's defaulted debt. The transfer was finalized at 9 o'clock this morning. I am presenting the deed to you, the new sole legal owner of this property." A collective synchronized gasp rippled through the crowd of elite guests. Patricia dropped her crystal champagne flute. It hit a stone paver and shattered into 100 glittering pieces, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot across the yard. Cassidy covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Her designer silk gown suddenly looked like a cheap, ill-fitting costume. The socialites who had viciously attacked my character online, the women who had believed my family's fabricated smear campaign, now stared at me in absolute horror. They realized in a single terrifying instant that I was not a helpless, bitter outcast. I was a financial apex predator who had just legally purchased the ground beneath their expensive designer shoes. I stepped past the frozen valets. I turned my back on my hyperventilating mother and addressed the crowd of wealthy spectators. "I want to thank you all for attending the final gathering at my newly acquired property," I announced, my voice ringing with uncompromising authority. I highly suggest you finish your drinks, locate your coats, and politely find your vehicles. This estate is now officially closed to the public. The guests did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. A mass frantic exodus began immediately. The elite of Chicago society scrambled toward the driveway, pushing past one another in a desperate bid to escape the radioactive fallout of my family's total financial ruin. They abandoned their half-eaten appetizers and fled, leaving my family completely isolated on the ruined lawn. Within 10 minutes, the yard was entirely empty of guests. Only Patricia Richard Cassidy and a few terrified catering staff remained. Richard was still shaking, clutching the eviction notice to his chest like a shield. Patricia began to hyperventilate, screaming hysterically that I could not legally do this to my own blood, that I was a monster tearing my family apart. I stepped right up to her, invading her personal space, forcing her to look directly into my cold, unwavering eyes. Blood is a biological accident. Patricia, I stated, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. But real estate is a binding legal contract. I am laying down the absolute law right now. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your clothes and leave my property. You are explicitly forbidden from removing any furniture, artwork, or valuable fixtures. Every single asset inside that mansion is now collateral against your fraudulent son-in-law's massive unpaid debts. Cassidy broke down crying, genuine ugly tears of pure panic. She grabbed my arm, begging me to tell her where they were supposed to go, claiming they had no liquid cash and nowhere to sleep. I looked at her with absolute zero empathy. I slowly peeled her trembling fingers off my crimson dress. Check into a cheap motel, I suggested coldly. Or sleep in your cars. 5 years ago, you threw me out into a freezing winter night with a single duffel bag and told me to survive. You claimed I was a useless burden. Now it is your turn to experience the cold. I turned away from their weeping, pathetic figures. I promised them that tomorrow at exactly 5 in the afternoon, a private armed security team would lock down the perimeter. Anyone still inside the gates would be arrested and prosecuted for criminal trespassing. I walked toward the waiting black SUV. Jonathan held the heavy armored door open for me. I slid into the plush leather seat, leaving my toxic family standing completely alone in the muddy wreckage of their fake aristocratic lives. The heavy armored door of the black SUV shut with a solid, satisfying thud. The outside world, with its ruined lawns and screaming relatives, was instantly muted. Jonathan took the front passenger seat, signaling the driver to move. The vehicle glided smoothly down the cobblestone driveway, leaving the North Shore estate behind. I did not look out the rear window. I simply opened my encrypted tablet and tapped an icon on the home screen. A grid of high-definition video feeds illuminated the display. When I finalized the debt acquisition at 9 o'clock that morning, my holding company legally absorbed the property's primary security infrastructure. Jonathan's team had remotely overridden the mansion's surveillance system, transferring master control directly to my personal server. The cameras my father had originally installed to protect his valuable art collection were now broadcasting a live, crystal-clear audio and video feed straight to my tablet. I watched the screen as my family stumbled back into the grand foyer, seeking refuge from the cold Chicago evening and the humiliating reality of their ruined garden party. The pristine interior of the mansion provided no comfort. The silence inside was heavy, suffocating, and loaded with toxic resentment. Richard was the first to snap. The polished, aristocratic patriarch completely unraveled. He grabbed a priceless porcelain vase from the entryway table and hurled it violently against the marble floor. The crash echoed through the empty halls, signaling the absolute end of their civilized facade. Richard turned his fury directly onto Patricia. He pointed a trembling finger at her face, his voice echoing with decades of suppressed rage. He blamed her obsession with social climbing for their absolute destruction. He screamed that her massive country club fees, her endless charity galas, and her compulsive need to buy imported white roses had bled their cash reserves dry. He stated that if she had not constantly demanded a billionaire lifestyle, he never would have mortgaged the ancestral estate to fund a risky tech portfolio. Patricia did not cower. Her own panic instantly mutated into vicious defense. She shrieked right back, her face contorted with ugly desperation. She blamed Richard for being a weak, incompetent businessman. She yelled that he had failed to provide the wealth she deserved, forcing her to rely on their son-in-law to maintain their status. She called him a pathetic failure who had literally handed the keys of their home to the daughter they both despised. The loyalty they had faked for 30 years evaporated in a matter of seconds. It was a brutal, ugly display of two narcissists, realizing the ship was sinking and immediately trying to drown each other to stay afloat. But the main event was happening in the adjacent living room. Cassidy and DeAndre had retreated to the leather sofas, their designer clothes stained with mud from the ruined lawn. The golden couple was violently tearing each other apart. Cassidy slapped DeAndre across the chest, her voice reaching a hysterical, piercing pitch. She demanded to know where the offshore money was hidden. She screamed that he had promised her millions from the Apex Vanguard initiative. She called him a useless fraud, a pathetic con artist who had destroyed her entire future. She demanded he transfer the hidden funds to her personal checking account so she could flee the country and start over without him. DeAndre grabbed her wrists, his face twisted with pure, unfiltered malice. The charming, sophisticated investment guru was completely gone, replaced by a cornered criminal. He shoved Cassidy backward, his voice booming through the hidden microphones. He roared that there was no offshore money left. He confessed loudly and clearly that the federal authorities had frozen his Cayman Island accounts. But DeAndre did not stop there. A drowning predator will always drag its prey down with it. He looked Cassidy dead in the eyes and threw her directly under the legal bus. DeAndre yelled that she had known the tech fund was a Ponzi scheme from the very beginning. He explicitly stated that Cassidy had forced him to accelerate the fraud to fund her lavish lifestyle. He reminded her of the exact dates she had demanded he skim cash from new investors so she could purchase luxury vehicles and book first-class flights to Europe. He stated that when the initial federal investigation began, she was the one who suggested they steal her parents' mortgage money to cover the margin calls. "You are going to prison right alongside me," DeAndre screamed, his voice raw with panic. "You spent the stolen money. You knew exactly where it came from. Do not stand there and play the innocent victim. You are a co-conspirator, and I will gladly testify against you to secure a plea deal." Cassidy let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. She lunged at him again, scratching at his face, completely losing her mind. She yelled that she would lie to the police, that she would claim he manipulated her, and that she would do whatever it took to save herself. I sat in the plush leather seat of the moving SUV, watching the brutal meltdown unfold in high definition. My finger rested calmly on the screen recording button. Every single word, every accusation, and every explicit confession of federal wire fraud was capturing directly to my secure cloud server. They were willingly handing me the final pieces of evidence required to lock them in federal prison for decades. They were too consumed by their own greed and panic to realize that the security cameras blinking in the corners of the room were no longer protecting them. Richard stormed into the living room, drawn by the sound of Cassidy screaming. He heard DeAndre threaten to testify against his favorite daughter. Richard grabbed DeAndre by the collar of his ruined suit, threatening to kill him for destroying the family. DeAndre shoved the older man backward, laughing a manic, unhinged laugh. DeAndre told Richard that he was a gullible old fool who deserved to lose his mansion. The physical altercation escalated rapidly. The family that had spent my entire life presenting a united front of superiority was now violently brawling in a half-empty house they no longer owned. The expensive tailored suits were torn. The carefully crafted social masks were pulverized. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt the profound satisfaction of a master architect watching a flawed building implode perfectly according to the demolition blueprint. I closed the recording application on my tablet, the digital files automatically encrypting and routing to my legal team. I looked out the tinted window of the SUV as the city lights of Chicago began to blur past. I had given them 24 hours to vacate my property. Judging by the feral nature of their collapse, I seriously doubted they would survive the night without calling the police on each other. The trap had closed, the locks had snapped shut, and they had willingly swallowed the key. The 24-hour eviction deadline expired at 5 o'clock. I did not watch the tactical security team escort my family off the North Shore estate. I was entirely focused on restructuring the Vanguard shadow funds from my new executive suite in downtown Chicago. The weather perfectly matched the brutal reality of their new situation. A freezing torrential downpour hammered the city, turning the streets into slick gray rivers. I finalized aggressive asset transfers, closed my laptop, and took the elevator to the lobby. My chauffeur was waiting with a heavy black umbrella. I stepped through the revolving glass doors and into the biting winter wind. The towering concrete and steel of the financial district offered absolutely zero protection from the violent storm. Before my security detail could open the heavy armored door of my waiting vehicle, two figures stepped out from the deep shadows of a nearby parking garage. They were completely soaked, shivering violently, and deliberately blocking my path to the car. I stopped under the wide canopy of the building overhang. It took me a full 5 seconds to recognize my own mother and sister. Patricia and Cassidy looked absolutely unrecognizable. Their expensive designer coats were plastered to their bodies, utterly ruined by the freezing rain. Cassidy's mascara ran down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks, making her look like a terrifying specter of her former golden child self. Patricia clutched a soggy, oversized designer handbag against her chest, as if it were a life preserver in a stormy ocean. They had clearly been standing out in the freezing downpour for hours, desperately waiting for me to emerge from the skyscraper. The private security guards flanking my vehicle instantly stepped forward, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts. I raised a single finger, signaling the guards to stand down and hold their positions. I wanted to hear exactly what these two ruined women had to say. Patricia lunged forward, stopping just short of my personal space. The aristocratic pride that had defined her entire existence was completely eradicated. She dropped to her knees on the wet, freezing concrete. The dirty rainwater soaked instantly into her expensive trousers. Cassidy followed a second later, collapsing onto the sidewalk right beside her mother. The golden child and the tyrannical matriarch were kneeling at my feet in the gutter, begging for their financial lives. The sheer desperation radiating from them was palpable and pathetic. "Stella, please!" Patricia wailed, her voice cracking over the deafening sound of the driving rain. "They locked us out of the house. The bank froze all the emergency accounts. DeAndre took the last of the physical cash from the safe and vanished. We have absolutely nothing left. We slept in the waiting room of a public train station last night. You have to help us. You have millions of dollars. Just give us enough to get a hotel room and a defense lawyer. We are your family. We are your own flesh and blood. You cannot do this to us." Cassidy reached out with a trembling, freezing hand, attempting to grab the hem of my tailored suit pants. I stepped back smoothly, avoiding her filthy touch. She sobbed uncontrollably, gasping for air like a drowning victim. "We are so sorry," Stella, Cassidy cried out. "We were wrong about everything. DeAndre manipulated us. He lied to us about the tech investments. You know I would never intentionally hurt you. You are my little sister. Please do not leave us out here to die in the street. We will do whatever you want." I looked down at them, feeling absolutely nothing. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt no lingering sense of familial obligation. They were not apologizing for decades of systematic emotional abuse. They were not sorry for locking me out in the cold when I was a struggling college student. They were only apologizing because their fraudulent bank accounts were entirely empty and I held the checkbook. "You are not my family," I stated, my voice slicing through the noise of the storm with icy precision. "You are biological strangers who used my existence as a punching bag to elevate your own pathetic egos. You did not come here for forgiveness. You came here to find a new host to leech off. I am not a charity, and you are completely out of credit." I unclasped my small leather clutch. I reached inside and felt the cold metal of a single coin. I pulled out a standard 25-cent quarter. I held it up between my thumb and index finger, letting the streetlights catch the silver edge. "When I was 20 years old, I begged you for $50 to buy groceries for the week," I reminded them, locking eyes with my weeping mother. You threw a single quarter at my chest and told me to find a payphone to call for a second job. You told me my hunger was not your problem. Your homelessness is not my problem. I flicked my wrist. The quarter tumbled through the air and landed with a sharp clink in a dirty puddle right between Patricia's trembling knees. "There is your bailout," I commanded. "Do not ever approach me or my property again. My security team will not be so polite next time." I turned my back on their hysterical screaming. My driver held the heavy door of the luxury SUV open. I stepped inside the warm, quiet interior. The door slammed shut, cutting off their pathetic wailing instantly. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, leaving them kneeling in the freezing rain to fight over a single silver coin. I instructed my driver to take the longest route back to my luxury penthouse. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the vehicle's miniature refrigerator and watched the city blur past the tinted glass. The chaotic storm outside raged on relentlessly, but inside my secure armored fortress, the climate was perfectly controlled and absolutely peaceful. My proprietary tracking algorithms had already mapped his backup infrastructure. DeAndre maintained a hidden climate-controlled storage unit in the industrial sector of the city registered under a fabricated corporate entity. He had spent the last 2 years siphoning untraceable physical currency into a heavy canvas duffel bag. It was his ultimate insurance policy. He was not planning to face a judge or hire a defense attorney. He was planning to vanish into a country without an extradition treaty, living out his days on a tropical beach while my family took the legal fall. I had forwarded the exact coordinates of his storage unit and his forged passport details directly to the federal authorities 3 hours ago. The brilliant digital dossier I compiled in the Vanguard server room served as the ultimate roadmap for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They did not have to conduct a lengthy, tedious probe. I had handed them a fully verified, legally binding confession wrapped in irrefutable banking data. The federal judge signed the arrest warrant immediately. DeAndre sped toward O'Hare International Airport in a rented sedan, believing he had successfully outsmarted the system. The torrential downpour that soaked his wife to the bone was severely delaying flights across the Midwest. The international terminal was a chaotic sea of frustrated travelers, crying children, and overwhelmed airline staff. DeAndre pulled his coat collar up high, clutching the heavy canvas duffel bag against his chest. He pushed his way through the dense crowds, his heart hammering against his ribs. He bypassed the self-service kiosks and marched directly toward the priority boarding counter for a red-eye flight to Dubai. He slapped his forged passport onto the polished counter. He flashed his signature charismatic smile at the ticket agent, utilizing the exact same charm he used to steal my parents' mortgage money. He thought he was completely invisible. He thought he had slipped right through the cracks of the collapsing empire. The ticket agent scanned the passport. The computer system did not generate a boarding pass. It generated a silent, immediate federal alert. My data packets had already integrated his fake aliases into the national security database. The agent looked at the screen, maintained a perfectly polite expression, and asked DeAndre to wait, just one moment, while the system processed his premium upgrade. DeAndre shifted his weight nervously, glancing at the terminal exit. His survival instincts kicked in, but he was exactly 10 seconds too late. 4 men wearing dark tactical windbreakers, bearing the bold yellow letters of the FBI, stepped out from the surrounding crowd. They did not approach with sirens or flashing lights. They moved with silent, lethal precision, cutting off every single physical escape route. DeAndre turned his head and saw a federal agent blocking the terminal exit. He spun around and saw 2 more agents advancing from the baggage drop. The sheer panic that washed over his face was a portrait of total, inescapable ruin. The arrogant wealth management guru realized his multi-million-dollar game was officially over. He made a fatal, desperate mistake. He dropped his fake passport, clutched his duffel bag of stolen cash, and sprinted toward the security gates. He did not make it 5 feet. The lead federal agent lunged forward, executing a flawless, brutal tackle. DeAndre was slammed face first into the hard terrazzo floor of the airport terminal. The impact knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. The heavy canvas duffel bag tore from his grasp, sliding across the polished floor. The zipper burst open under the sudden force. Stacks of $100 bills spilled out, scattering across the terminal floor like worthless green confetti. Hundreds of delayed travelers stopped dead in their tracks, gasping in shock as the violent takedown unfolded right in front of the premium check-in desk. The federal agents pinned DeAndre to the ground, pulling his arms violently behind his back. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed loudly over the ambient noise of the airport. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated money laundering, and grand larceny," the lead agent announced, his voice booming with undeniable authority. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." DeAndre thrashed against the cold floor, his custom-tailored suit jacket tearing at the shoulder seam. He screamed that he was an elite investment manager, that he was being framed, and that he would sue the entire federal government. His desperate, pathetic cries only amplified his total humiliation. By a stroke of absolute poetic justice, a major local news network crew was stationed right next to the security gates. They had been dispatched to cover the severe storm delays and passenger frustrations. The cameraman immediately pivoted his lens away from the flight boards and zoomed directly onto the violent arrest. The red recording light blinked steadily, capturing the entire catastrophic downfall of the fraudulent mastermind. The news anchor, a seasoned professional, began broadcasting the arrest live on the 10 o'clock news. She narrated the scene with shocking clarity, confirming that a prominent Chicago wealth manager had just been detained by federal authorities while attempting to flee the country with a bag of stolen currency. The footage of DeAndre pinned to the ground, surrounded by scattered $100 bills, was beamed directly into the living rooms of every single wealthy socialite, country club member, and business associate my family had ever known. I arrived at my luxury penthouse just as the live broadcast hit the airwaves. I walked into my expansive, warmly lit living room and commanded the smart home system to power on the massive flat-screen television mounted above the fireplace. I stood in the center of the room, still wearing my crimson dress, and watched my arrogant brother-in-law get dragged to his feet by armed federal agents. His face was bruised, his suit was ruined, and his arrogant facade was completely pulverized. The final lingering shreds of my family's fabricated social standing were incinerated on live television. They could no longer hide behind fake smiles or garden parties. The entire city now knew they were intrinsically tied to a massive criminal enterprise. I took a slow, refreshing sip of my sparkling water. The first domino had just shattered the floor, and the courtroom slaughter was right around the corner. The media circus consumed the Chicago news cycle for 7 grueling months. I spent that time assisting federal prosecutors, meticulously translating complex database logs into undeniable visual evidence. When the trial began, the downtown federal courthouse was surrounded by eager news vans. I bypassed the aggressive crowd through a secure side door, wearing a sharp navy suit that projected absolute authority. Inside, the courtroom atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. I took a seat in the front row directly behind the prosecution table. DeAndre sat on the opposite side, his transformation entirely pathetic. With his offshore accounts seized and his assets frozen, he could no longer afford an elite defense team. He wore a cheap gray suit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. He looked exhausted and terrified, stripped of the arrogant swagger he once used to dominate family dinners. His theatrical defense attorney relied heavily on emotion rather than facts. Pacing in front of the jury box, he attempted to weave a ridiculous narrative of corporate victimization. He claimed DeAndre was simply an ambitious investment manager, overwhelmed by the complex automated trading algorithms of Vanguard Financial. He painted my brother-in-law as a naive scapegoat, a tragic victim of a corporate misunderstanding. He looked directly at the jury and argued DeAndre had no idea the fund was a Ponzi scheme, insisting the missing millions were the result of a software glitch, not intentional theft. The federal prosecutor, a razor-sharp woman with zero tolerance for fiction, let him finish his dramatic performance. Then she called me to the witness stand. I walked past the defense table without breaking my stride. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the whole truth, and took my seat in the witness box. I adjusted the microphone and looked directly at the 12 members of the jury. I did not look angry. I did not look vindictive. I looked like a lethal efficient machine engineered to deliver pure facts. The prosecutor began by establishing my professional credentials. I detailed my extensive background as a senior data architect and my comprehensive understanding of cryptographic financial ledgers. I established my credibility so firmly that the defense attorney sank lower into his chair. We moved immediately to the core evidence. The prosecutor activated the digital screen mounted on the courtroom wall. I guided the jury through the complex labyrinth of DeAndre's financial infrastructure. I did not use confusing jargon. I translated the data into a brutal, undeniable narrative. I pointed to the inbound capital injections from his local investors. I showed the jury the digital pathways where those funds bypassed the technology sector entirely. The defense attorney leaped to his feet, shouting an objection. He claimed my data was circumstantial and manipulated. The federal judge, an older man with a stern expression, immediately overruled the objection and instructed me to continue. I projected the hidden subledger I had decrypted in the Vanguard server room. The room went silent as the jury stared at the numbers glowing on the screen. I highlighted the platinum-tier recruitment contract bearing DeAndre's verified digital signature. I explained the mechanics of his 20% cash commission. I pulled up the wire transfer receipt showing my parents mortgaging their ancestral home. I showed the jury the immediate, automated diversion of $500,000 directly into DeAndre's Cayman Islands account. The evidence of premeditated, calculated theft was irrefutable. The defense attorney attempted a desperate cross-examination. He strutted up to the witness stand trying to intimidate me. He accused me of harboring a personal vendetta against my family. He suggested I had used my computer skills to fabricate the offshore routing numbers out of pure jealousy. He asked me if I harbored deep resentment toward my sister and her husband, trying to paint me as a disgruntled outcast seeking revenge. I leaned into the microphone. I looked the defense attorney dead in the eye. I stated that my personal feelings were irrelevant to the mathematical reality of federal wire fraud. I told him that financial data does not possess the capacity for jealousy. The numbers on the projection screen were independently certified by federal banking investigators. The prosecutor then delivered the final fatal blow. She submitted Exhibit 42 into the court record. It was the high-definition audio and video file captured by my apartment security system during their midnight ambush. The prosecutor pressed play. DeAndre's frantic voice echoed through the silent courtroom. The jury listened in horror as he admitted to dealing with a severe liquidity crisis. They heard him demand a $500,000 bridge loan to cover his fraudulent margin calls. They heard Cassidy shrieking her malicious threats, promising to fabricate domestic battery charges and file false police reports to extort me for cash. The recording captured the raw, unfiltered truth of their criminal desperation. It destroyed the defense's narrative of corporate misunderstanding. An innocent man does not bang on an apartment door at midnight, begging for a $500,000 bailout to hide his financial losses. An innocent man does not stand by while his wife threatens to commit perjury to steal money from her own sister. The audio file finished playing. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The jury members turned their heads in unison, glaring at DeAndre with undisguised disgust. They saw him not as a confused corporate employee, but as a ruthless predator who destroyed his own family and community for personal gain. The defeated defense attorney slowly walked backward across the floor. He bumped into his own table and collapsed heavily into his chair. He nervously rubbed his temples, completely out of legal maneuvers. DeAndre buried his tearful face in his shaking hands as the reality of his impending prison sentence hit him. He realized there was no escape, no loophole, and no way to charm his way out of a federal indictment. I sat perfectly still in the witness box, my expression neutral, knowing that the foundation of his fraudulent life had just been reduced to dust. The judge struck his wooden gavel against the sounding block with a sharp crack that echoed through the cavernous courtroom. He instructed the jury to retire to the deliberation room to reach their verdict. I stepped down from the witness box, with perfect composure, smoothing the lapels of my navy suit, and took my seat in the front row of the gallery. The waiting period is usually a grueling psychological torture for the accused. For me, it was simply a scheduled intermission. The evidence I had provided was so mathematically flawless and structurally complete that the jury did not need to debate the facts. They only needed to fill out the paperwork. Exactly 42 minutes later, the heavy oak doors at the side of the courtroom swung open. The 12 jurors filed back into the box. DeAndre stood up at the defense table. His knees visibly buckled, forcing his attorney to grip his elbow to keep him upright. The court clerk retrieved the sealed envelope from the jury foreman and handed it to the judge. The judge adjusted his reading glasses, broke the seal, and reviewed the documents with a grim, uncompromising expression. He looked directly at DeAndre before asking the foreman to read the verdict aloud for the official court record. On the count of aggravated wire fraud, guilty. On the count of interstate money laundering, guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit financial extortion, guilty. The word echoed over and over again, each repetition striking DeAndre like a physical blow to the chest. He collapsed heavily into his chair, gasping for air, as if the oxygen had been vacuumed from the room. The judge did not schedule a separate sentencing hearing for a later date. Given the flight risk demonstrated at the airport and the overwhelming severity of the financial destruction, he chose to deliver the final judgment immediately. The judge leaned forward, his voice radiating absolute judicial fury. He looked at DeAndre and stated that he had rarely seen a case of such calculated predatory greed. He condemned DeAndre for weaponizing the trust of his own family and community to fund a lavish, fabricated lifestyle. He stated that financial crimes of this magnitude shatter lives, destroy retirements, and erode the very foundation of societal trust. The judge declared that a strong, undeniable message had to be sent to anyone who believed they could steal millions and simply vanish across international borders. The judge handed down the final sentence. He ordered DeAndre to serve 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He also mandated full financial restitution, though everyone in the room knew the stolen money had already been seized or squandered. 2 federal marshals stepped forward instantly. They grabbed DeAndre by the arms, hauled him to his feet, and clamped heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. DeAndre did not look back at the gallery. He did not look for his wife or his in-laws. He kept his head bowed, his shoulders shaking as he was marched through the side door and out of polite society forever. The mastermind of the Apex Vanguard initiative had been officially erased from the board. But the legal slaughter did not end with the prison sentence. The collateral damage of federal asset forfeiture is a brutal, sweeping process. Because Cassidy was legally married to DeAndre and had actively benefited from the stolen funds, the federal authorities stripped her completely bare. U.S. Marshals arrived at the cheap motel she had been hiding in and confiscated every single item purchased with the fraudulent money. They seized her designer handbags, her diamond jewelry, and the luxury SUV she had managed to hide from the initial repossession. They froze her personal checking accounts to satisfy the outstanding tax liabilities generated by the illegal income. Cassidy was forced to declare severe, catastrophic Chapter 7 bankruptcy. She possessed absolutely zero marketable skills, having spent her entire adult life relying on her golden child status and her husband's fake wealth. Without a single dollar to her name and a credit score utterly annihilated by federal liens, she was forced to accept a minimum wage job working the night shift at a commercial laundry facility just to afford a room in a boarding house. The woman who had thrown my grandmother's inheritance into a trash can was now spending her nights scrubbing industrial linens for pennies. The devastation of my parents was equally absolute. With the North Shore estate legally transferred to my holding company and their remaining cash swallowed by DeAndre's collapse, Richard and Patricia were left entirely penniless. Their elite social circle had abandoned them the moment the FBI raid hit the evening news. The country club formally revoked their membership. The local politicians stopped returning their calls. The charity boards erased Patricia's name from their letterheads. They were toxic liabilities, and high society excised them with surgical precision. With no friends, no assets, and no remaining lines of credit, my parents were forced to rent a tiny rundown one-bedroom apartment on the far industrial outskirts of Chicago. I ordered my legal team to run a discreet background check on the property just to confirm their new reality. The reports were incredibly detailed. The apartment was located directly beneath the elevated train tracks. Every 7 minutes, the entire building rattled with the deafening roar of passing steel cars. The linoleum floors were peeling. The heating system was severely unreliable, and the windows looked out over a sprawling concrete parking lot. Patricia, who had spent decades hosting catered garden parties and buying imported white roses, now spent her days trapped in a cramped, drafty living room. The suffocating reality of her new existence broke her aristocratic facade completely. Richard, stripped of his patriarchal authority and his country club prestige, sank into a bitter, silent depression. He spent hours staring at the peeling wallpaper, refusing to speak to his wife, silently blaming her for the absolute destruction of their family name. They had built their entire identity on the illusion of superiority, and without their wealth, they had absolutely nothing left to offer each other but resentment. I sat in my spacious, sunlit office at the top of the Vanguard Tower, reviewing the final court transcripts and the asset forfeiture logs. I placed the documents into a heavy file folder and locked it inside my secure filing cabinet. The toxic dynasty that had tormented me for 33 years was officially eradicated by the unyielding rule of law. They had not been destroyed by petty revenge or illegal sabotage. They had been destroyed by their own relentless greed, exposed to the harsh light of justice. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out across the sprawling, vibrant city. The storm that had raged through my life was finally over, and the path forward was completely clear. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside the entryway. The air smelled faintly of dried lavender and old paper. The silence inside was not oppressive, like the dead silence in Patricia's foreclosed mansion. It was a deeply comforting, peaceful stillness. The living room was exactly as Beatrice had left it, filled with functional wooden furniture and shelves overflowing with classic hardback books. I walked over to the large bay window and pulled back the heavy floral curtains, letting bright sunlight flood the dusty hardwood floor. I had hired a professional contracting crew for a structural restoration next week, but I wanted to prepare the space myself first. I wanted to touch the walls, clear the debris, and honor the unbreakable foundation she had built for me. I took off my tailored navy blazer, rolled up the sleeves of my white blouse, and began clearing the heavy area rugs from the living room floor. The original oak floorboards beneath were scratched and deeply worn by decades of footsteps. As I moved a heavy mahogany bookshelf away from the far wall, the wooden leg caught sharply on a loose plank. I knelt down to inspect the damage. The floorboard had been intentionally cut, pried upward, and carefully wedged back into place. A single rusted nail head protruded slightly from the edge. My analytical mind immediately recognized the deliberate anomaly. I walked into the kitchen, retrieved a flathead screwdriver from the utility drawer, and returned to the living room. I wedged the metal tip beneath the loose oak plank and applied firm, steady pressure. The wood groaned loudly and popped free, revealing a narrow, dark cavity between the floor joists. Resting inside the dusty recess was a sealed, heavy-duty plastic pouch. My heart beat a fraction faster against my ribs. I reached down and pulled the pouch free. Inside the waterproof casing was a thick envelope made of high-quality textured stationery explicitly addressed to me. The handwriting was unmistakably Beatrice's. I broke the thick wax seal on the back of the envelope and pulled out 2 crisp pages of handwritten text. I sat cross-legged on the dusty floorboards, the afternoon sunlight illuminating the dark ink, and began to read. My dearest Stella, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means you have taken possession of my home and successfully navigated the chaos I intentionally left behind. You deserve to know the entire truth. I never suffered from dementia, and I never forgot the immense value of my assets. I watched your parents and your sister for 30 years. I saw their unchecked greed, their hollow obsession with social status, and their utter disdain for hard work. I watched them treat you with unforgivable cruelty, simply because you possessed the intellect and independence they entirely lacked. I gripped the thick paper tightly. I knew that if I handed over a $45 million trust fund directly in my will, Your parents would have deployed an army of lawyers to contest it. They would have tied you up in probate court for a decade, draining the funds and destroying your peace of mind. Cassidy and her arrogant, fraudulent husband would have stopped at absolutely nothing to steal what was rightfully yours. So I created a test. I knew their fatal flaw was their superficiality. They only respected things that looked shiny and expensive. They despised anything old, plain, or broken. The words hit my chest with staggering clarity. I retrieved the original founder equity contract from my secure deposit box, Beatrice wrote. I placed it in a cheap manila envelope and tossed it into a box of worthless trinkets. I made it look like absolute garbage. I knew without a doubt that Cassidy would judge the book by its cover. I knew she would mock its appearance and throw it away because she lacked the intelligence to look deeper. But I also knew you, Stella. I knew your brilliant analytical mind. I knew you never took anything at face value. I knew you had the resilience to stand quietly while they mocked you, and the sheer brilliance to recognize a cryptographic watermark when you saw one. I designed a financial weapon, disguised it as trash, and trusted their staggering arrogance would blind them to it. They willingly handed you the key to the empire because they genuinely thought it was worthless. Tears finally blurred my vision, washing away decades of residual pain. You are the only person in this bloodline with the moral compass and tactical genius required to wield this power. I left you the tools to eradicate their toxicity and set yourself free. Build your empire. Never look back. All my love, Grandma Beatrice. I folded the letter and held it against my chest. The suffocating weight I had carried since childhood evaporated entirely into the sunlit room. I was not a victim who had stumbled into a lucky payday. I was the chosen successor of a brilliant strategist. Beatrice had seen my suffering, recognized my strength, and orchestrated a flawless masterclass in psychological warfare to ensure my absolute victory. I looked around the quiet living room, feeling a profound, unbreakable sense of closure. The toxic ghosts of my past were permanently exorcised, replaced by the fierce protective spirit of the woman who had always believed in me. I channeled that fierce protective spirit directly into the foundation of my new empire. The realization that my grandmother had weaponized her wealth to arm me changed my entire operational strategy. I did not just want to sit on a mountain of corporate dividends and attend boring shareholder meetings. I wanted to build a fortress. I took $10 million of my initial liquidity payout and officially launched the Beatrice Vanguard Coalition. It was not a standard, feel-good charity that hosted expensive galas and handed out oversized checks for photo opportunities. It was a highly aggressive, elite philanthropic strike force dedicated entirely to rescuing victims of financial abuse and family fraud. I knew exactly how predators operated behind closed doors. I knew how arrogant relatives manipulated trusts, forged signatures, and drained the accounts of the vulnerable. Now I had the capital, the technology, and the corporate authority to hunt them down. I purchased a sprawling, open-concept commercial space on the top floor of a modernized industrial building in downtown Chicago. I refused to lease an office with dark corridors or suffocating wood-paneled walls. My headquarters was surrounded by massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that let the blinding sunlight pour into every single corner. There were no shadows left for parasites to hide in. I personally designed the data infrastructure for the entire floor, installing server racks capable of running complex financial decryption algorithms in seconds. I built a command center that looked less like a non-profit organization and more like the trading floor of an aggressive hedge fund. I did not hire socialites or people looking to pad their resumes. I recruited a team of absolute apex predators. I hired former federal prosecutors who were tired of bureaucratic red tape. I brought in ruthless forensic accountants who treated hidden offshore accounts like personal puzzles to be destroyed. I hired brilliant, hungry data architects who understood how to track digital footprints across international borders. They did not care about my last name. They did not care about aristocratic pedigree or country club memberships. They respected me solely because my code was flawless and my strategic vision was completely uncompromising. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Exactly 8 months after my family's spectacular implosion, I stood at the head of the main conference table. The sunlight hit the polished glass surface, illuminating the faces of my senior staff. Naomi, my lead litigation director, slid a thick digital tablet across the table toward me. She was a brilliant, razor-sharp attorney who had previously dismantled corporate monopolies for the Justice Department. She pointed to a series of highlighted transaction logs on the screen. "We isolated the hidden routing numbers," Naomi stated, her voice brisk and entirely professional. The uncle drained the college funds from his nieces and funneled the cash through 3 separate shell companies registered in Delaware. He is currently attempting to close on a commercial real estate property using those exact stolen funds. I looked at the data arrays. The financial camouflage was decent, but it was nothing compared to the labyrinth DeAndre had attempted to build. I tapped the screen, filtering the metadata to expose the original wire transfers. "Draft the injunction immediately," I ordered, my voice projecting absolute undeniable authority. "Send the complete forensic packet directly to the Federal Fraud Division and file a civil asset freeze before the banks open tomorrow. We are going to lock his accounts before he even signs the closing documents. We are taking every single penny back with interest." Naomi smiled, a predatory gleam in her eyes. She did not question my directives. She simply nodded, grabbed the tablet, and marched out of the room to execute the legal strike. There was no hesitation, no petty family drama, and no manufactured crisis. We identified the threat, mapped the data, and neutralized the predator. It was a perfectly oiled machine running on raw intelligence and pure justice. I walked out of the glass-walled conference room and poured myself a cup of black coffee from the break room espresso machine. I leaned against the counter, watching my team operate. The room buzzed with the sound of rapid typing, low-level strategic discussions, and the hum of high-capacity servers. This was my chosen family. They were a collective of brilliant, dedicated professionals bound together by a shared mission of dismantling financial abusers. I had spent 33 years trapped in a suffocating, toxic dynamic where love was constantly weaponized as a tool for extortion. My biological relatives had treated me like a useless, invisible ledger entry. They had constantly tried to break my spirit to elevate their own pathetic egos. That dark, oppressive atmosphere was completely eradicated. I had replaced it with total, undeniable control. I was a majority shareholder of a global financial institution. I dictated market moves. I funded multi-million-dollar rescue operations for people who had nobody else to fight for them. I possessed an unbreakable independence that no one could ever steal, manipulate, or forge. I walked over to the massive windows and looked out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. The city below was a complex network of moving parts, a grid of endless data points that I now had the power to navigate and conquer. I remembered the freezing night. I stood outside Vanguard Financial, holding a torn piece of yellowed paper, completely isolated and surrounded by people who wanted to see me fail. The contrast between that shivering, discarded girl and the woman currently commanding an elite philanthropic empire was staggering. I took a long, satisfying sip of my coffee. The bitter, robust flavor grounded me in the present moment. I did not feel any lingering sorrow for Patricia Richard Cassidy or DeAndre. Their memory was nothing more than a closed file in a deleted database. I had used their boundless arrogance to secure my freedom, and I had used their profound ignorance to build an untouchable fortress. The legacy of Grandma Beatrice was not just a piece of paper or a massive bank account. Her true legacy was the unyielding, ruthless clarity I now used to protect the vulnerable and punish the greedy. The foundation of my new empire was built on solid, unbreakable stone, and it was entirely spectacularly mine.